Hello, welcome. We're more than a week into the general election campaign here in the UK. We have a widely expected change of government. Normally, you might expect some excitement. There might be groups in society lining up, going out there onto the streets, talking about alternative visions for the country's future, clashes of big ideas, a real choice. Doesn't feel like that. The atmosphere here has been limp and low energy. And if anything, there's a surging cynicism, almost a derision about the choice before people. The Labour Party seems basically to be about to roll into power by default, by not being Tory, after the Tories monumentally self-sabotaged and pretty much forfeited their claim to be a party of government. So what sort of choice are the voters actually being given? With me today to work out the truth of the Uniparty is Tom McTague, our political editor, here in the studio. And joining us from Northern Ireland and East Anglia, respectively, are two of our star columnists, Mary Harrington and Aris Roussinos. Welcome, everyone. So, Mary, let me start with you. You wrote this amazing piece for us yesterday. You seem to feel like those two main parties are moving towards some kind of uniparty.
It's not so much moving towards some kind of uniparty as having failed to move away from some kind of uniparty. Having written in great excitement in 2019, one of the first pieces I wrote for UnHerd on the possibilities opened up by Boris Johnson's landslide win if the Conservatives were able to sense the mood of the nation and to take advantage of a political alignment which then seemed to be opening up, in which politics seemed briefly as though it might move away from a double liberal consensus which had come to seem increasingly stale and towards perhaps something more closely aligned with what the voters appeared to want, which was moving away from post-democratic international governance as exemplified in that case by the European Union and the various institutional and chattering class bodies which had lined up to endorse the European Union, and towards something perhaps more directly accountable to the popular voice and the popular vote. I was enthused at that point by the prospect of this happening and thought it actually had a fighting chance if the party, and particularly Boris Johnson as their leader, could step up. As it turned out, that was a very short-lived hope because COVID-19 happened about 10 minutes later, at which point everybody was locked down under a kind of universal global technocracy, it seemed, out of which we haven't really emerged since then. The momentum which we seem briefly to have in the United Kingdom dissipated, and the Conservatives have emerged from that permanently tainted by whether by Partygate or by any one of innumerable scandals, and have shambled, lurched, faltered their way into a desperately belated announcement of general election at this point, with two policies that seem about as defensive as it's possible to be, which is to say oriented not towards the future, not towards even the Red Wall, certainly not towards any kind of younger vote or vision of the future, but purely and dispiritingly and with grim pragmatism towards the last people who can perhaps be relied on to vote for them, which is to say retired homeowners in the southeast.
So those policies specifically are?
And those policies specifically are returning to national service, which nobody seriously thinks they're actually going to try and do. Everybody knows the Conservatives are going to lose the next election, and it's just a question of how badly. And so here they are proposing a policy which nobody really ever imagines they're going to have to implement, and is just there to galvanise older people who think, well, maybe we can get those young people to stand up straight and do something useful for once, instead of sitting around with their pronouns and their funny haircuts, scrolling on TikTok all day.
And then pensions.
And then not just continuing the triple lock, but turning it into a quadruple lock, and siphoning off yet more of stagnant wages from Britain's shrinking proportion of working age adults, most of whom haven't seen a pay rise in a great deal longer even than Rishi Sunak or any one of his predecessors has been to power. So as to shore up the pensions, which keep alive and in relative comfort the last demographic which can be relied on to vote for the Conservatives.
So has it made you cynical, Mary? That's the question. You said with hope. What do you feel now?
I started with hope, and it's just left me, it's left me furious and despairing. It feels as though there was a last best hope of some kind of an escape from the dead consensus of double liberalism that was squandered I mean, perhaps the knees were shot from underneath it by COVID-19, or perhaps it was squandered, or perhaps in any case the moment passed, and now what we have is not even double liberal. It doesn't even have the optimism of the Blair years. It doesn't even have the optimism of the Cameroon years, where there was sort of continuity Blairism, sure, but they had some kind of a moral vision and some kind of a sense of direction and where they're going. And literally now they're just circling the wagons and trying not to lose too badly, and trying to kick the economic and the social and the political can down the road by a series of desperate measures with the aim of just hopefully of clinging on, of a few of them clinging to power for a little bit longer. I've honestly just had it up to the back teeth with them.
Aris, I'm going to bring you in here. Yeah. Do you share Mary's frustration, rage? What's your mood about this general election?
Yeah, disillusionment, cynicism, just disaffection. I mean, look, I'm not going to vote. There is no point. If you do accept the analysis that we're facing a kind of uniparty election, that there is no meaningful difference between two different parties, that whatever you vote for, you'll get what they want us to have, which is the experience of the past few years, past few decades even, then the natural question is, well, what do you do with that? If voting doesn't actually have any meaningful effect other than kind of changing the faces on Newsnight every night, then what is the point? So yeah, I think that level of disaffection, I think actually it's a more meaningful response to the current situation, not voting, than to kind of resignedly hope that this time everything will be different, that Starmer will lead us into some kind of bright second coming of Blairism.
But so it's quite a big thing. You're encouraging people not to vote. I mean, is there? I'm
not encouraging people not to vote. I'm saying I'm not voting. I don't think there's any.
But is there really no point? There are still some differences between them, are there not? I mean, you could cast a vote for an outlier party like Reform. There, you have options.
I suppose in some ways, actually, think about it. Like, I'm lucky to live in Northern Ireland, in a constituency where voting is openly tribal, based on kind of age-old ethnic grievances. There's no... The political system doesn't function effectively. And I think that's what we're heading towards in the rest of the UK, in a sense. Like a kind of tribalised dysfunction.
This was very much what I was getting at in the argument I made yesterday, Freddie and Aris, in the sense that I wanted to frame these stupid and pointless policies. The Conservatives, just as in actually the Labour government as well, have effectively more or less abolished the nation state. We aren't really a nation state in the pre-war sense anymore. Our foreign policy is set from the USA. We can't control our immigration policy. That much is obvious. The whole point of the Brexit vote, no matter what the civic nationalists might have said, the reality is the point of the Brexit vote was to be able to control our immigration policy. And as it turns out, that wasn't controllable either, because all we did was swap immigration from Europe for immigration from the rest of the world. And it's in practice for all sorts of complicated economic and political and regulatory reasons. Our immigration policy is set by a mixture of business interests and international laws, and not by any kind of democratic mechanism at all. And there are innumerable other instances of this, whether it's environmental laws or and what we're really looking at is a political environment which is functionally, on most of the issues that matter, post-national. And as such, how much difference a supposedly national election makes is just not as significant as it used to be. And I think people intuit that. And there have been various popular revolts attempting to mitigate that situation. But honestly, I think that ship is a dot on the horizon at this point.
I'm going to bring in Tom McTague for a moment. I need you to be Captain Sensible here, Tom. Tell us why our star columnists are wrong to be so pessimistic and cynical about this national election.
That's quite a tricky task you've set me there. I think that, I agree with what a lot of Mary and Aris have said. I was particularly struck by Mary's line about trying to impose national service on a state that is no longer a nation state anymore. And when you have Aris on the line here, that is particularly kind of relevant because he lives in Northern Ireland, where, of course, the national service wouldn't apply. It didn't apply last time we tried to impose it after the war. When we tried to impose it during the First World War, it led to the breakup of the UK. So there's a kind of particular reason there. And obviously, Aris lives in a country where it is dysfunctional. And by design, you cannot change who is in power. There is always going to be the same two parties in power. So we have these kind of systems already in place, and they've been in place for 20 odd years now in the case of the Good Friday Agreement institutions. I would say that there are important things that exist in politicians beyond the platform that they present to their country. And they lie in their kind of instincts about who they are. And I think that is really what defines politicians and particularly leaders, because so many of the crises that they face are not going to be dealt with in their manifestos. And so what are their instincts? And I think there are different instincts between the Labour Party and the Conservative Party, between Keir Starmer and between Rishi Sunak.
What are they?
Well, in particular, I think Keir Starmer doesn't have the kind of instincts that Mary or Aris would like. I think he is much more in favour of the kind of international institutions that Mary is talking about that are kind of constraining the nation state. I think his instincts are absolutely to defend those institutions and the kind of framework that is stopping things from happening.
It's kind of legalism. He's a lawyer. He will love the World Health Organization. He will love the International Criminal Court. These are the kind of organizations that he feels are pointing towards a virtuous and well-ordered world.
Absolutely. European Convention of Human Rights, I think, is one obvious case as well. And I ultimately think Keir Starmer is more left-wing than his policies or the people that he's bringing forward today. I think he's much more left-wing than Tony Blair.
So what does that actually mean nowadays?
I think he's much more statist. I think he's much less comfortable with inequality. I think he's much less comfortable with free market enterprise than Tony Blair is, for instance. And I think some of his advisors are more kind of... Actually, I think they are a bit more socially conservative. I think the question on that, though, is I think the Labour Party itself, the Parliamentary Labour Party, is still kind of socially where Blair was. So I think, again, if you're thinking about instincts, the instincts of the Parliamentary Labour Party are going to pull them back towards social liberalism. But I think you're going to have a kind of statism, brownite kind of agenda under Keir and Rachel.
I mean, it doesn't sound dramatically different from what we've had in the past few years. Hard to think of more statism than the COVID years, for example. Aris.
What's good about the Labour kind of proposals and manifesto is the idea. So, we've got like Rachel Reeves talk about securonomics, which is an awful term, but it does tap into the reality that we have entered a period of kind of great global destabilization, the end that we're living through, that we see, on our phones every day, every minute of the day, practically in one corner of the world, of the fall of America's kind of liberal empire, and all the ramifications of that mean that all these kind of global institutions that Starmer may be instinctively inclined to kind of maintain or preserve, they're rapidly ceasing to exist. They're falling apart around us, right? So the whole idea of, securonomics, the idea that Britain has a kind of stable and secure energy and an industrial base, that's exactly what, Biden's trying to do in the US.
But, sorry to interrupt, Aris, but securonomics, I agree it's a stupid sounding term, but the principle behind it might be sensible. But then if they are as committed as they are to net zero, to... No,
I agree. Yeah,
there is no path to securonomics if all we're doing is signing up to these international conventions that hollow out what remains of our industrial base, no ability to produce our own energy. We're nowhere on that agenda. If you're really serious about energy security and industrial security in an environment of kind of global competition, then we should be building vast numbers of nuclear power plants, like even digging up coal temporarily. Probably, I hate to say this, I believe in climate change. I think it should be, mitigated against as best as possible. You don't have to say that on this channel, Aris. We won't cancel you if you don't. No, but here's the thing, I actually do. But I think in the current circumstances, Britain alone kind of plunging forwards, to net zero is it's fundamentally unattainable. It is in itself a risk to kind of British national survival. There is a reason Russia's doing well, selling its mineral wealth, its fossil fuel wealth, that Russian oil and gas is gladly being
consumed by India, by China. That is one of the building blocks of kind of the new order of global competition that we now live in.
Just to go further down that rabbit hole for a moment, and perhaps to be provocative for a moment. I mean, people tend to assume when I say we've abolished the nation state that I'm not happy about it, or that I'm angry about it, or that I think we should go back. But actually, I don't think we can go back. I don't think the abolition of the liberal era nation state is reversible. I don't think we're going to go back to that kind of democracy again. And I'm not even sure that we would necessarily want to, as things currently are, for a number of the reasons that Aris has just outlined. A lot of the challenges we now face, a lot of the technologies we now face are so systemic and so transnational that it may well be that some kind of international order is the least worst solution. I don't like that particularly for all kinds of all kinds of reasons, but sometimes I look at it and I think, well, I'm not really sure what the alternative is. And perhaps the problem isn't so much international technocrats as the specific technocrats that we have. I don't know, but there are times when I think the democratic nation state isn't coming back, and nor is the ethnic basis that actually, let's be honest, that the democratic nation state was founded on. Not without the kind of an order of political interventions which seem a long way out of the Overton window at the moment.
Tom, what we've just been talking about there, and I think what both Aris and Mary said is really profound, which is almost like there are major global tectonic plates shifting. Mm-hmm. There are resource crises, security crises, energy crises, and it's almost like none of this is on the ballot paper. We're having almost a kind of a sham election here in the UK, pretending that old questions, shall we do national service, tax and spend, marginal differences. It's like the 2015 election. I mean, we look across to Europe, and they're having real elections where people are actually voicing these fundamental, deep concerns about immigration, deep concerns about the security situation, about what our approach is in Ukraine, about the relationship with America, about industry, energy. None of that seems to be on the ballot.
I think you might be being a bit kind to the European votes there. I mean, I'm not sure if you looked at Germany, there was much of a difference between the SDP and Merkel's party. But I think we've been here lots of times before. I think it's very difficult for parties to present to the public difficult choices in elections where there are trade-offs. As Aris was talking about earlier, you may have to choose between reindustrialization and net zero. But at the moment, both parties say that you can have both, and actually they're kind of mutually complementary. And I think we've been here in, say, the 60s or the 70s, where the Labour Party would present to the country, well, we can reindustrialize and reinvigorate the economy and maintain our global presence. Well, actually, what happened was you had to choose between the two. If you wanted to reindustrialize the economy, you had to devalue the pound, and that cost us our influence in the world. They wouldn't level with us, and so you ended up having a crisis that ended up removing the Labour government. I think you could see, you mentioned 2015 as an obvious parallel to today. In some senses, though, Ed Miliband was presenting something different to David Cameron. David Cameron was presenting a referendum on the EU, and Ed Miliband was talking about pre-distribution of wealth and these kind of reforms.
I'm impressed you remember that.
Yeah, but if you go back to 97, I think that might be a parallel in some senses, but without the hope that Mary was talking about. You had then Tony Blair and John Major both offering the same policy on Europe, the same policy on foreign policy, the same policies when it came to Britain's economic position. We will get rich off the City of London and we will redistribute that around the rest of the country. And that was essentially it. They both agreed on Northern Ireland, the Northern Irish peace process. They agreed on everything.
So there was a Uniparty already in 97. The country just picked Tony instead of Major to lead it.
Yeah, and it involved marginally more redistribution, marginally more kind of money going into public services. And that's effectively what you have today. It's just that Keir Starmer doesn't have any of the hope or any of the money that Tony Blair had.
Aris, let me just ask, the kinds of issues that Tom just mentioned, for example, net zero is a good case study where it's actually convenient to both of the main parties to pretend that they can square this circle. So the Tory party, as I understand it, is still nominally committed to net zero. They have a net zero secretary in Claire Coutinho who goes around kind of saying, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, we're not really into it, but we're formally committed to it some decades hence. Labour Party have watered down their commitment. So it's those kind of issues which really make voters pissed off and they get conspiratorial. They get deeply cynical because they're like, if there's a stitch up between the two main parties where they're both pretending that something is possible in order to allow the charade of their disagreement to continue, that really just makes people annoyed. Do you sense that, and are there other examples?
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. I think where I disagree with you is your assessment that what I'm saying is kind of doom laden and cynical. I think actually beyond that, beyond the immediate next few years, which I think are going to be very bad, like really bad, I think there is potentially some hope glimmering on the horizon, in that what we've seen over the past few years is the Conservative Party just completely destroy its own legitimacy. Like, it is not a functioning party of government. You would have to be completely insane to trust the Conservative Party to see Britain through the coming few years or decade or whatever of, international disorder that we're now seemingly committed to kind of hurtling our way through. Is the Labour Party going to be much better? I think they're going to be more competent managers of decline, but they have no answers. They're going to be wildly unpopular in the next year, 2 years. So if you go back to, I don't know if you read the David Lammy, foreign policy manifesto, essentially, for foreign affairs. It nodded to all the kind of buzzwords about, the liberal order is collapsing, it doesn't exist anymore, there's a whole new world of global competition. But actually, when it came down to it, it was the same old. It had no answers. It just appealed to like these old, empty kind of platitudes, and a world that no longer exists. If that's
I think the buzzword was progressive realism, wasn't it? Which you seemed to decide was neither progressive nor realistic.
Yeah, it's an oxymoron. It's just meaningless.
So hold on, where's the optimism again? I lost the sunshine.
The Conservative Party, is no longer a credible party of government. It's hard to see it as a credible party of government in the next few years. I think Labour's going to go the same way. Like, if you think that the problem isn't either of the two main parties, but the broader overarching system which contains them, then when both parties fundamentally make themselves, illegitimate, despised by the vast majority of the population, then I think we'll be entering the world of politics, like actual politics.
And how does that manifest itself?
It could manifest itself in lots of different ways, some good, some bad, no doubt.
Such as? Give us a hint. I mean, sketch for us this the glimmer of hope on the horizon.
Okay, so I don't think I'm unique here in not bothering to vote, not being motivated to vote for any of the offerings available to me, because I don't think they give real choices. I think that's a growing tendency. I think we're seeing the voters essentially quiet quitting from the Westminster system. That can't go on for long. I think Cummings is right when he says that, the Westminster system is broken, and historically one of the things that changes a broken political system, that reforms a broken political system, is a period of, unfortunately, geopolitical strife, right? Like,
but what's the system that replaces it?
I don't know. I mean, if you genuinely believe that there is no meaningful choice available to you in the coming elections, then, the question presents itself: is this meaningfully a democracy? I'd say no. If I don't feel there's any point in me voting because it has no meaningful effect, then, what does that make me? It makes me a dissident, right? I'm a dissident against a system that I don't think works, and therefore I don't want to continue to exist. I'd be quite happy in a more democratic system, in the sense that I would like to live in a democracy. I'd like my vote to actually matter. I'd like the popular will to be expressed through government, which it currently isn't.
I think Aris is right about the democratic crisis. I would just extend that by saying that a corollary of having abolished the nation state is that if you don't have a nation state, you don't have a polity in the sense of being able to circumscribe a group of people to see as the electorate. And I think the end point of the political crisis we're currently in will be the effective, if not the explicit, abolition of democracy. We're well on our way there already. In fact, I would go as far as to say that the Labour Party's announcement that they're going to extend the franchise to children it indicates another step on that path. Because if you're extending the franchise to children, then that suggests you don't take it seriously as something with any meaningful political force, because you've given it to a whole load of people who you wouldn't even trust with a packet of cigarettes. So why would you trust them with anything that's actually going to do anything? All that tells you is what the Labour Party thinks voting does, which is to say not very much. And I think and beyond that, I mean, we see the same phenomenon in the United States where the Democrats, the equivalent of the Labour Party, actually the equivalent of the Tory Party, but where the Democrats propose extending the franchise to basically anybody who shows up. And I'm sure there are members of the Labour Party who'd like to do the same thing. At which point we have to understand that what we're looking at is something more like a sort of economic trading zone where you become a player just by existing there. And citizenship isn't really a thing anymore in the sense of having any kind of democratic weight.
So what you end up with is sort of voting like rituals that don't actually really, where the parameters have already been set and which don't actually affect anything structural or, of any major political import. A little bit more like the voting you get on Strictly Come Dancing. Than the voting, than the kind of voting which might actually change the direction of policy on any of the fundamentals.
So soon we'll be voting by phone, and you can vote as many times as you like and get charged £1 each.
Yes, exactly. You get charged £1 each, and you get to vote on, what colour tie is Keir Starmer going to wear at the next Prime Minister's questions. But the question of how or whether we should control our borders is entirely out of scope.
I'm going to leap on that exact thought, Mary, because controlling our borders we haven't talked enough about. It feeds into this idea of what is a coherent nation and who are the cohort that get to decide its future. Nigel Farage has obviously lent into it and built the Reform Party around that anxiety that people have. Is this, as Nigel Farage says, the immigration election?
I don't know. It doesn't feel like an immigration election to me entirely. I mean, I think it's clearly going to play a huge part in it, almost like background noise, in that you're going to have Nigel Farage constantly sort of drumming that beat in the background. And I think reasonably so. I mean, immigration is at something like 600,000 a year net. I mean, we have, apart from the year before this one, we've never seen anything like that. And I think this is a sort of an interesting point, in that we had immigration as a major political issue in Britain in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s. And then there was a consensus which effectively created what some academics call like the years of zero immigration from 68, 70 and 71. There were two major acts of parliament that changed immigration and really put it to bed as a political issue. And it only really started coming back in the early 2000s when immigration started to rise to the numbers that we've seen. So in some senses, I think it's inevitable that immigration is going to play the kind of role that it has played in Britain. It did before when it rose, and it was nothing like these numbers. You're talking tens of thousands in the 60s, not hundreds of thousands that we see today.
Aris, why didn't Rishi Sunak do something like call in the army or the navy, do a great big public display of towing boats illegally back to France, stick two fingers up to international convention and say we're just not allowing them to land here? Some dramatic move like that might have captured people's imagination.
I mean, even that would just be, like a kind of empty publicity display. I mean, the vast majority of immigration coming into Britain currently is legal immigration through routes that were opened up intentionally by the Conservative Party over the past 2-3 years.
So you think it's intentional?
I mean, yeah. I mean, Boris Johnson was fundamentally a social liberal, right? So he genuinely believed, he was an open, adamant believer in the benefits of mass migration. Liz Truss worked very hard to get a free trade deal with India that would have effectively hugely maximised India's contribution to Britain's kind of migration rate currently. So that is the Conservative Party that actually exists in the real world. So it's kind of absurd that they've got this reputation amongst liberals and leftists as this kind of radical right wing, frothing at the mouth anti-migration party, when they have undertaken the most essentially extreme migration regime that Britain has ever seen, like ever in its history.
And do you think Labour would be tougher than the Tories?
I mean, it'd be hard not to be, but when you look at whatever Starmer's instincts, you see examples of Labour MPs who are themselves committed advocates of mass migration as a good in itself, not for any kind of economic purpose. That seems to be the Conservative argument, even though the economic arguments for it don't hold up, but just as a social or a cultural good in itself as a policy that should be pursued, whatever the costs. It's very interesting seeing how divergent Britain is from the rest of Europe. Even, look at south of the border from here, even in Ireland, now migration is becoming, a major political issue where it hadn't been at all. If you look at the forthcoming European elections, we're going to see probably a huge growth in support for the radical right, who have naturally radical solutions to mass migration. That is a political current that's completely absent from Britain. And somehow the Conservative Party, while managing to vastly increase the rate of migration, have somehow become tarred as extremists.
And actually, even Nigel Farage and the Reform Party, if you put them side by side with some of the European parties of the radical right, seems quite centrist. There aren't... He won't say publicly, at least, that there are going to be programs of mass deportation, those kinds of things. You see across Europe, there are examples of politicians talking about that, not here. Mary, what's your sense of the immigration debate? And is it more of this sort of cosplay where there's an official narrative and then there's what people are really thinking, and that disconnect is what's driving the cynicism?
Well, I certainly there's the disjunction between what even otherwise very centrist people now think and what's being said even by the supposedly radical right individuals like Richard Tice is huge. What we're talking about here is a strength of feeling which is not being reflected by public political discourse.
Tom, what do you say to that? Do you think that the strength of feeling and the kinds of policies that people would actually be okay with are just not present in the public conversation? Do you think that's true?
Yeah, I think it's evidently true, and it has been for since 2004, when Tony Blair made the decision not to impose transitional controls on the Eastern European countries going to Europe. But actually, if you look at the figures, migration was going up from 1994, and it had reached record numbers by 97. It jumped then up until 2004, and then it jumped again. And then, as Aris and Mary have said, it jumped enormously post-Brexit. And I think it is astonishing to think that happened, that we were hitting record highs of 300,000 net migrants a year arriving in the UK before Brexit, and that's gone up to 600 and 700,000 post-Brexit. It seems an extraordinary thing that the government completely lost control. I don't quite agree that it was on purpose. I don't think that they would have done that knowingly, but I think they liberalised the regime, believing their own hype that Brexit had reduced any public anxiety over immigration, and that the only thing that the public were concerned about was control rather than numbers. And I think that is just evidently untrue. The public are aware that a lot of people were moving to the UK and weren't happy about that. What do you do about it, though? You have to pay a price to reduce immigration. You have to change the nature of your economy. And neither of the parties seem willing to own up to that and to say, right, this is what we need to do to reduce immigration. It's going to be a bumpy ride to get there, but we think it's worth it to revitalise the nation state, to answer your concerns, to show that democracy is working, all of those kind of things. And at the same time, those people who are advocates of the levels of migration that we're seeing at the moment don't own up to the costs either. So it seems that I wonder whether part of the thing that we're talking about here is you don't get to change things dramatically in democracies without a crisis beforehand. It took the winter of discontent and the IMF bailout in the 70s before you got Margaret Thatcher. It took mass migration in the 2000s before you got Brexit. You required the Depression before you had Franklin Roosevelt in the United States kind of saving capitalism. So, I suppose one irony, and this is where maybe there is some hope, is that if you had Roosevelt declaring that he had saved, it took the Democratic Party to save capitalism. Does it require the Labour Party to save the nation state? And the Labour Party used to believe in the nation state. It used to believe in nationalising institutions. And it used to be Eurosceptic. That was its position until the late 80s. It's not inconceivable. It's not ideologically incoherent for a Labour Party to be Eurosceptic again and to try to rebuild the nation. But it requires very difficult choices.
So I want to ask each of you guys joining us remotely to respond to this challenge. which is, I think, I like to put myself in the mind of someone listening who doesn't agree. And I think if you're one of the centrist dads that Mary is referring to, you would say a lot of this is very dark and almost seems to be glamorizing the falling apart of the nation in a way that might strike them as irresponsible. And they might say, actually, the history of the UK is quite a centrist dad kind of nation. Actually, they're not very hardcore on immigration. They tend to be repulsed when leaders come before them that sound nasty and mean and too hardcore. And actually, they want a kind of soggy centre, and maybe they're getting what they voted for. Mary.
Well, I think the centrist position now is a total moratorium on migration. I think if you scroll the comment section on the Times, for example, you'll see that. That is now the centrist position, but it's being presented as the radical right. Do I think this is all dark and sinister? Yes, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm wrong about the abolition of democracy in the nation state. I sincerely hope I'm wrong, but it's probably too early to tell. And I think, in the name of centrist dad, we should impose the centrist policy on what is, regardless of what the political parties would like us to think, the most salient issue of this election.
Aris, are we being overly dark? And is there a kind of sunshiny centrist dad out there who wants exactly what they're being offered?
To the centrist dads, I'd say, look around at modern Britain. This is the country you wanted. And, now you can own it, right? I don't think we have the time available to change it before we head into the crisis years that I think are coming. The centrist dads need to own the Britain they've created.
Aris, Mary, Tom, thank you very much. That was Mary Harrington and Aris Roussinos, both UnHerd columnists. Tom McTague, our political editor. Thanks to all of them. I guess that was not the kind of conversation you likely hear on the BBC or Sky News every day, where they are trying to talk up the big drama of the choice between the two main parties. What we sense is a lot of cynicism and a lot of anger about the fact that neither of the main options presented are really inspiring at all. If you feel that we have got it wrong, or indeed that we got it right, let us know, as always, in the comments. And in the meantime, we'll see you soon, and thanks for joining.